Okay, welcome everyone. Great to see you all. Following on from last month's event with Shonika Rishi from the Oxford Centre, really pleased to have James Biddulph with us. I should say Dr. James Biddulph. So James and I have known each other for a long time actually, because James was our founding principal of Avanti Court in Redbridge. So that was his first headship and our first head of that school. So he set the school up and then later was stolen by the University of Cambridge. So I'll read his formal profile out. So James gained an advanced skills teacher status in creativity, and in 2003 was awarded Outstanding New Teacher of the Year for London. He's the inaugural head teacher of the University of Cambridge Primary School, the first primary university training school in the UK, and is a founding fellow of the Chartered College of Teaching. So we have a real expert amongst us today, and we're going to get into the topic of the education system and how we can evolve it. So there's some questions that I've got for James, and we're going to try and make this a little bit more interactive than we normally do. So we'll see how that goes, and we'll go for 90 minutes in total, depending on how interactive that is. We'll have some time for questions at the end as well. So with that, I'm going to kick off. James, I was at the University of Cambridge Faculty of Education last week, and one of the questions that I was asked, which I thought was could be a good intro for us, is around what you think are the key challenges in the education system today.
Thank you, and it's very good to be here. I think the first challenge is to understand the reality that 270 million children don't go to school in the world, and their families probably didn't go to school. And so the questions we're discussing today are really on the luxury side of the spectrum. I must also there's a confession I have to make also, that most of my expertise comes from the children, and so I'm speaking on behalf of them a lot of the time. So there's a boy called Tom, it's not his real name, but he comes to my office every day. He has autism, and he comes in, sometimes he sits and doesn't say very much, and says goodbye then, and goes off. He walks into meetings I'm having with governors often, sits down for a bit, and then walks off and says goodbye. And that sometimes he sits and he just tells me what's going on in his head. And on this one day, I was having a finance meeting with my colleague, and he said to me, the problem is the adults aren't doing enough, Dr. Biddulph. So we kind of stopped panicking that we haven't got any money in the budget and listened to Tom. And he said, what it is, I was cycling to school and my dad was cycling in front of me, and there were these boys who were cycling with their parents, and the parents were saying, just ring your bell and get people to basically push people out of the way. Just ring it, keep ringing it, and let other people have to get out of your way. And Tom said, this is not right, because if they're not the parents, the adults aren't teaching the children how to be respectful, or how to give way to somebody else, to give space to another human being. Instead, you have to ring your bell and get people out of the way. And he went on a bit like this, but what he was really raising for me comes back to the challenges that we don't listen to children enough. We don't think they have a voice. We don't think they have agency. We don't think they have ideas. A lot of people think they are people in waiting. The schools are waiting rooms for when they become adults. And systems are essentially like factories waiting for them to become adults. And Tom is very profound and has many more ideas than I'm able to share today. So I think there are three existential risks or uncertainties in the system. The first one is climate change. And young people are very, very aware of it. And they're more aware than the adults in many ways. And they care very much about it. I think the second existential uncertainty is to do with the greater inequalities that we're seeing. COVID has showed us the greater inequalities in our systems and our societies. And the third is about the sense of purpose and self. Young people are struggling to know who they are, how they're going to be in a world that everyone tells them is falling apart, where things aren't fair. And I think Tom not listening to children is one. These existential uncertainties brought about by climate change, inequalities, and a sense of purpose and self. And the third one is, I think we've had a history of trying to standardize education. In times of uncertainty, people want to make everything certain. And people don't like change. Humans don't really like change. We tell children, come on, learn from your mistakes. No one really likes mistakes. So we don't like change or failure. And so when greater uncertainties arise, the system wants to make things certain. So this greater standardization that's coming through in teacher training, in teacher development, is actually making schools much more compliant and less innovative, inspiring, and willing to reimagine what could be. So that would be my starting point.
So I'm going to pick up on the last one, because I personally feel that last point that you made there around the standardization piece is, for me, that's kind of the most pronounced in terms of, and we'll get into this a bit as we progress with the conversation about, but we know that there's an increasing movement towards homeschooling, for example, and the kind of underpinning drivers to that. And I think one of the things that underpins that is that there's a perception that schools are factories, and that there is a system through which they go through, and the ability of a school or any system to cope with and maximize the individual's potential is limited by definition of it being within a system. And therefore there's a kind of a pushback against that in terms of how do we individualize stuff. And sometimes in education we talk about personalized learning or differentiation, and that's often about things like curriculum pathways or that. One of the things that struck me when I was learning, as you did from Tom, a child in one of our schools, was around the responses to behavior. So behavior policy, and how two children may react very differently to the same behavior policy, though the school has to have one behavior policy, or does it? and I think there's that piece around personalization, which I think is really pressing.
So we abandoned a behaviour policy. We didn't really. Don't tell my company. We called it a relationship policy.
Yeah.
Because if we can start from a relational perspective and try to understand and that the other human being, the other child, or the other 30 children in the class, or in my school, 630, and we start building relationships with them, then when behaviour becomes tricky, it's much easier to engage and to find positive ways through. So even at that level, it starts with a relationship. And the kind of, when schools have standardized policies to make it fair for everyone, equality doesn't mean the same for everyone. Tom needs a different behaviour approach in my school to the other children in the school, because he has different ways of thinking, different ways of being. And so if we don't acknowledge that if we don't celebrate the diversities in our school, then we want to make everyone the same, then I think there's no chance to have an individualized approach. Individualized doesn't mean we make the learning different for 30 children. That's impossible, unless you provide more funding and more people. But it does mean we try and understand the human that we're trying to engage with on a relational starting point.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that what it is that we focus on as the lever to effect that kind of change and movement away from factory line, industrial, whatever perceptions around education that there might be. So lots of people, right, have picked up on this previously, just about kind of the education system currently being a leftover or a hangover from centuries ago, and how do we move away from that? Some of that is, of course, around the structures and the systems. Some of it for many schools is around the focus on developing character and individual character, and all that means with regards to their value system and morality and ethics. And at Avanti, kind of a key piece of that is around their spiritual development, and how can their spirit, because I suppose in some respects spirituality is the opposite of that system industrial conveyor belt approach. It's the individual and the individual flourishing. Is that something that you see as, like, how do you see that from your perspective in terms of kind of the role of spirituality in schools?
I think we are heading into the territory that happens in education all the time. It's a very polarized place to be. So you're alluding to the fact that it's either spirituality and thinking about the child, the individual, the relationships, all that, or it's factory, i.e. good standards, everyone gets good A-levels, SATs results are good. And in my school we say, well, we want both, we don't want one or the other. It's not about saying we all kind of have a group hug and we're all lovely, because children need to be able to do other things in their lives. Yeah. And it's also not the reverse, it's not the opposite of that. Yeah. So the system is so polarized. We talk about creativity or performance. We talk about individualization or child-centered learning or teacher-directed learning. But humans are much more complex. It should be everything. It should, teachers, if I try to teach you to play the piano, for example, and said, go and have a guess where middle C is, child-centered. No more, you'd have hours trying to guess. But there are times I have to direct and say, this is the middle C. And then we explore. So it's not one or the other. And I think because everyone has a vested interest in education and most people have been to school, so everyone's got an opinion about what should happen in schools, that makes it a very kind of tricky place to be. And I think the reasons why people are choosing to homeschool their children, according to the recent survey from the government in March 2022, the top three were real concern about COVID and the impact of that, 19%. The second was about philosophical, ideological reasons, that they didn't believe the schools were able to offer what their children needed or what they believed should be a quality education. And the third was matters to do with mental health or other health reasons. So parents are choosing, they were perceiving schools are not able to provide for their children in those three: the safety of COVID, the mental health, and then the philosophy of what education should be.
And that part around mental health, because that's a very wide-ranging, bucket, and it could. I'm guessing that many of those people who had responded in that way could be perceiving about, as I think you alluded to that the school's ability to deal with my child's mental well-being and emotional health, even potentially, as opposed to that the child has already presented with a mental health concern.
I think many schools are really struggling because the system around us is not able to support at the moment because of the reasons that many of us know about to do with funding or will. So there are schools. I think it is a real struggle in schools. That's without a doubt. However, surely we have a collective responsibility to work together to try and find. It's not to find ways through for children. Children don't. I tell the parents in my school, you don't just leave your children with us and we'll do the education and we'll give them back to you finished. It's about a partnership and discussing when it's difficult. And sometimes the discussion would lead to actually a realization that the schools aren't right. But it shouldn't be for what in the US is now 40% more children are being homeschooled in the last 3 years compared to the last 3 years. It shouldn't be a mass, because eventually you'll get schools that will have children whose parents can't actually do it. So the disadvantage, it becomes a tiered system. And then it goes back to my first kind of challenge, that the biggest challenge is that 270 million children aren't educated at all.
And we've also seen parents, electing for homeschooling, and sometimes it's about the insecurities that the parent may have, which they're superimposing upon the child in terms of they're projecting what experience the child might have in school as you said, because everyone's been to school, so everyone's an expert, and we know that not all schools are the same either. So there is that, I think, tug of war just between what's in somebody's mind and what it actually may be or may not be in the school as provided.
There are many times when adults who are older than me come into my office shaking because they're going to see the head teacher, and we're just having a chat about something. But they've and it's not about me, but the label head teacher has throwbacks to the cane or the slipper or whatever it may be.
Yeah. Okay, so let's. Can we talk a bit about? We spoke about, touched upon spirituality and that being, kind of an important aspect of schooling. You mentioned this point around, the 3 reasons why parents are choosing home education. What is it, like, can you give us an overview from your perspective in terms of what does the current curriculum provide for in terms of spiritual development? And I mean, from Avanti's perspective, obviously we've got a unique curriculum that we're developing, which we can talk about, and I'm sure you have at your school, and we can talk a bit about that. But can you give us an overview first?
The big question really is what do we mean by spirituality?
Yeah, okay, let's start there.
Or what do we mean? What's the purpose of education? The Cambridge Primary Review asked, which was the biggest piece of research conducted into primary education since the 1960s, asked that question. What's the point? Why are we doing it? And so one question we ask in my school over and over again, that you've done in a similar way, is what do we want our young people to be like when they're 40? So should we hand it over to you?
Yeah, go for it.
So audience members, what do we want our young people to be like when they're 40? I'll do it in a true primary school style. So you can talk to each other for 10 seconds and come up with 2 ideas, and then if you've got 10 seconds, off you go. What do you want them to be like when they're 40 years old? These middle-aged, sorry.
2-3 words, yeah.
In my school, we wiggle fingers to stop, but you can do what you like. Thank you, everyone. Thanks.
You should have figured it out by now.
So throw your ideas, just 1-word answers, 1 word.
1 or 2.
Content, thank you. Content. That side of the room is behaving very well. This lot. Rich. Okay. Rich, and then investing in the schools. Thank you. Compassionate. Yeah. Balanced. Free. Successful. Happy. Responsible. Respectful. Confident.
Educated.
What does that mean? Other words have been used as open-hearted, willing to try new things, engage with difference. Pardon?
I wanted them
to be spiritually minded, yeah. And again, what does that really mean in an education context? The word happy is an interesting one, isn't it? Because, if we strive for happiness, we want to be happy, that's fine, but life isn't like that. It goes up and down. But if we strive to be happy and we try to tell our children that we're trying to make them happy, then we're just falling into the Facebook, Instagram way of being. Everyone, if you're not happy, you have to, everyone looks happy on Facebook. My life isn't like that. I'm not miserable, but it's certainly not happy. It's happy as well. So if that's what we're trying to do, then what do we have to do in schools? Because you can't mandate people to be respectful. You can't make them be respectful. You can't make people be free. You can't make people be spiritual. You can't make people be compassionate. So in my school, in terms of spirituality, what we've tried to do is look at what's the core. We ask this question, and then a real focus is how do we develop compassionate citizens? And we use those 2 words because compassionate is about doing more than just having sympathy or empathy for people. And then the citizenship is about being active. And then around that core compassionate citizenship, we said, well, we need to think about how to develop thinking around that, to develop children's thinking, develop their being, so not just thinking about it, but actually kind of an embodied understanding of what it means to be compassionate, And the third bit is about how do we help them enact it. Now, in primary school, enacting being compassionate is more difficult in secondary school because you can't send them on the street to go and help. It's more complex. But that it doesn't say spirituality, but it is embedded. It's embedded in the values that both Avanti have and my school have. So the spirituality kind of it's not just a thing you do on a Thursday afternoon. We're doing the spirituality lesson. Can't be that.
No, and I think just for us, we have faith schools and we have community schools which don't have a religious designation, and so the challenge around what is spirituality and what place does it have in a non-religious school is an interesting one. So we've done some work just around trying to define what we mean by spirituality, because to your point, right, like when somebody says we want them to be spiritual, what do we mean by that? And so we've been talking to staff and kids about what it is that means, and we boil it down to 4 things that we're going to develop in terms of how we do CPD, how we engage with the curriculum, and try and develop that spiritual insight that we talk about. So the first one is around identity, and I think that's a big one in today's world, just because of the different layers and ways in which identity is talked about and thought about from a child's perspective, and the fact that we have so many different layers of identity, and whether those layers are to do with race, to do with place of birth, to do with gender, etc., etc. And then when you peel back all of these different layers of identity, and I think that process of a child asking themselves, who am I? And where does that lead them to in terms of their thinking, I think is a spiritual process in terms of how they can better understand that. And then the result of that, and when we talk about kind of what's the benefit of spirituality, I mean, from all the information that we have to hand, we understand that there is a very pronounced benefit in terms of mental and emotional well-being and security about somebody being secure in their identity. And if their identity is at the superficial levels of what we call identity, then we can be sure that that's going to really be unhealthy for them, because they're going to be constantly dependent on external modes of verification and validation of who am I and how good am I and what am I worth. So I think that in itself is it's not dependent upon a religious teaching or a religious institutional kind of affiliation or anything like that. But I feel it's a very powerful spiritual practice.
Governments, the UK government does recognise, religious education is one aspect, but they also there's a spiritual SMSE, which is spiritual, moral, social, and cultural education. So it goes from the self to the culture. So there is a concept of what it could look like. But I don't think there's enough discussions in staff rooms or in spaces like that to say, well, what does that really mean? We understand science, for example, asking the questions of, what is, what is, but the spirituality aspect is like saying what might be or what is out there. We know the scientists and theologians often ask similar questions. They just have different spectacles to explore together. And then the schools also have the PSHCE as well. But there's in the last 10 years, I've wrote some of them down. There's relationships education, relationships and sex education, health education, personal social health economic education, personal social health citizenship education, so then spiritual, moral, social and cultural. There's all these acronyms. And yet I And their parents are wanting to take their children out of schools because something has gone, something's missing.
Yeah, and I think that there's in Avanti we've got these three, right? So we've got educational excellence, character formation, and spiritual insight. And I think a lot of people but in their minds, because they don't know how to talk about spiritual in a clear or defined way, they collapse spiritual with character. So they collapse the whole kind of values, moral ethics with spiritual.
Yeah.
But I think that there's a distinction there, and I think it's not. Whilst they're clearly interrelated and one, and affect each other in a very integral way, I think it's the easy way out almost. And what happens is then the conversation or the difficult conversations around spiritual don't happen. And the reason why it struck me more so because when I interview, potential Avanti staff, one of the questions I ask them is to talk about the spiritual insight aspect of Avanti. And one of the questions I'll ask, for example, is how do you define or how do you think about spirituality? So like everybody comes in and they talk about, I love the idea of spiritual insight, that's why I applied for the job, Avanti, etc. So they all come in with that. But if you ask them the question, well, what do you think of spiritual insight? What do you mean by spiritual insight? I mean, it goes quiet. Because most people, I feel, haven't really, because either they're thinking about it from a religious perspective, because they've taught in a religious school, so they'll say something like, well, I've taught in a Christian school and that's spiritual insight. Or they'll think about it in a very it's just a nice feeling and quite nebulous kind of conversations around it. So that's why I felt like for us to start to really pin it down into what do we mean. And so one of them is around identity. The other one is around an antidote to materialism. Because I think we're taking a stand at saying, look, materialism is not the only way. So there's a huge societal push towards materialism, and the kids face it on their digital devices, on or whatever media they're consuming, etc. And just to kind of reinforce the point that it doesn't have to be just about materialism.
But the challenge of you recruiting people is embedded in the text of government policy, for example. So the SMSC, spiritual, moral, social, and cultural education, it says that the spiritual bit is to have, explore or develop spiritual experience. Yeah, so how on earth do you... So my contestation is that spirituality can't be in school. You can't have spirituality in school. Because how as the head teacher can I say, right, today we're going to have a spiritual experience and make it meaningful for everyone in that class? So I went on holiday to see some relatives I haven't seen for a long time in Greece. My grandmother was Greek, and saw my cousins, and went to the church that she would go to, and it's full of icons and gold, and it's very impactful for me anyway. And it smells of incense, and there's candles, and it resonated with me, and I'm not saying I had a spiritual experience necessarily, but there was something that reminded me of her, of the experience of being in this very holy place. How do you create that in a school? It's almost impossible, because in my school there's always clutter everywhere to begin with. But how do you create those experiences?
Yeah.
So if you can't manufacture that, which I think is really very difficult, even in a faith school, what is it we're trying to do in schools? So the reasons why when schools opened 150 years ago, to almost 200 years ago, they were set up by churches to create places to develop good people to have good Christian upbringing. That was it. So the reason for schools, the reason for all our schools, historically comes from a place of churches setting up schools. So, but the churches were often next door to the schools, so there was a kind of direct relationship. But as we've grown apart from those places of spirituality, how does a school like mine, which is in the middle of, on the edge of Cambridge, it has no faith organisations around it, how do we create for children a meaningful spiritual experience? So it's difficult. I don't think we can. So what do we do? Well, the second point down is about schools are community makers. So a lot of faith schools that I've been in feel very special because there's a sense of community, or sangha, or whatever language you want to use. There's a real sense of connectedness because of a shared purpose. So is that the starting point for spirituality? Spirituality.
I think that's really interesting. So I think there is. I think that's what also attracts me to trying to define spiritual. To your very point about, the kind of origins of schools and closeness to the church, etc. That attracts me to defining spirituality outside of religion, or outside of the confines of religion, in terms of, when I think back to spiritual experiences that I may have had, not all of those spiritual experiences were in a religious context. And I think that's why exploring, so for example, if I just refer to the third aspect of how we define spirituality, it's about the scope and the scope and expanse of our consciousness. So the state of our consciousness is something that we all experience. Like we experience how we are today and how our consciousness fluctuates over time, week to week, day to day, even moment to moment, changes in consciousness. So that the kind of engagement with things like, who am I, an antidote to materialism, processes, and it could be different things for different people, and they don't always need to be religious practices, which help us elevate our consciousness and help us think about things wider than just me. So that's kind of the bit around kind of just widening our scope of what do I care about? Yeah. And I think I just think that there's a challenge that we have to meet about how to make spirituality relevant. And I don't think we're that far apart on this, because I think much of it is about helping children or allowing children to ask the right questions. Not the right questions, but do you know what I mean? The questions that will lead you down a different road of inquiry than you might ordinarily do.
You remind me of a child from a Avanti course who was on the edge of being excluded from his previous school and joined us in year 1. So he's only 5, 6 years old. So to be labelled as somebody who's disruptive, the very reason why you want to probably homeschool the child was that perfect example. And he was there for a few months, and similar to other Avanti schools, we would start with, we would sing every morning, and then we would have a meditation circle. And remember, I shared it with you, I received an email a complaint from the parent. Dear I was Mr. then, I hadn't spent all the money on the PhD. So dear Mr. Biddulph, what have you done to my son? And I thought, oh God, here's another one. If it's not that, or parking, or what I'm going to fix the parking issues as well. What have you done to my son? He is very difficult in the morning because he tells me off when I'm making him late, because he wants to come and make sure he doesn't miss the meditation every morning. It goes on like that for a long time, saying what a considerable shift in her child, in his behaviour, in his attitude, in his ability to be with difference. He found it difficult to be with other people, and he learnt to be part of a community. And the 2 reasons why he complained to his mum so incessantly that she said, I need to change my behaviours as a parent and be on time, and also the reason why she was glowing in her respect for what we were doing is because he understood that he didn't want to disrupt his friends in their meditation, and he wanted to be completely part of it. So you could argue he's developed a practice that is developing some spirituality, a sense of who I am, from a sense of personal self.
Yeah. Okay. So let's see. This is a really interesting one, because I think both. Like, if we think about spirituality, we were talking about earlier the dichotomy between kind of the individual spiritual flourishing and the system as it is to try and produce, or efficiency, etc. So I think it's the case with religion as an institution, like religion is institutionalizing that spiritual, which in many would argue should never be institutionalized, because it's the very opposite of what, in line with what we're talking about. So I feel like both with religious institutions that can almost take the life out of spirituality, in a similar way, education and educational institutions, i.e. schools, can potentially take the life out of education, or the life out of that spiritual spark that we see in children when they come to school. And there's I sense a risk in that, like a risk that we become, as schools become institutionalized in a way that the negatives of which we've seen in religious institutions. Does that resonate with you, or do you not see that potential risk?
I think the risk is it becomes standardized again.
Yeah.
Because there's always a draw to, because when you have so many children in a school, is to make it, because you have to cope with loads of people walking around and everyone's expectations and needs, that it drifts towards standardization, and then it becomes this is how we do it at our school, rather than that's how we've done it at our school. What could we do now? And raise a question. So if I'm arguing that maybe spirituality can't be done in schools, what can be done to get young people and young adults and young children to be stepping towards questions about spirituality, or becoming having a religious practice or some kind of practice? So, for example, Martin Fleming, who you may know, he says that the starting point, and probably the biggest thing you can do in school, is to put philosophy into the curriculum. When I can't remember ever at primary school ever being asked a big question like what happens when you die, but children are fascinated by that. And really, if we want to understand what spirituality is in a school or in any context, it links to what our understanding of purpose is, and then what do we think happens when you die? Because if you believe nothing happens, then there's a kind of very clear view, a secular scientific life you might lead. If you think something else is there, that's the spark of asking the question, what might be? And then you send children down a rabbit warren of questions and wanting to be curious and open, and all the things that you mentioned about what young people should be like when they're 40. If we can start philosophizing with children in schools, and we do it in my school, I know Avanti has it, we timetable it, it's within the kind of framework of our school. If you come to visit our school at any point, the children will ask you questions, because they're used to people asking questions and then asking them to ask better questions. Surely is that the starting point? Because it's about, as Nietzsche says, if we're trying to seek something, and the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment really kind of was standardizing and saying this is the answer. And then, so what do we do with the question?
Yeah.
Who am I?
Yeah, as I say, I think the questioning approach is a very valuable one. I mean, just from the perspective of the Gita or the Bhagavatam, like that's one of the things that really attracts me to those texts, because they are structured as questions and answers. They're a conversation which takes place, as opposed to a one-way instruction. It's a series of layered questions and answers. And I think that model, which has clearly kind of lasted over millennia, is intrinsically valuable because, and that's why it's lasted, because I think it speaks to the heart in terms of what is it that we seek, and the ability to be able to respond to what's on the child's or the other's mind and in their heart in terms of what they're thinking about.
And you mentioned your conversation in Cambridge with other people from different faiths, and there was a Jewish man there who said, Jews are just argumentative. We argue, and because that's the point. It's about discussing what's my understanding of my belief. What's your understanding? Let's argue it out. But by doing that, you get closer to, or you enrich your understanding of who you are and how you want to be and how you want to practice your own spirituality. Yeah. There's something in the Rig Veda you mentioned once before also. Yeah,
I mean, I think, I guess, what I was responding to also to that gentleman was, I do, clearly there are lots of texts, even in the Gita, Arjun is, you could say, arguing with Krishna. Some of the questions he asks are quite challenging questions. But there's also a different form of conversation, which is not necessarily argumentative. Yeah. And I think, sometimes I think back to, like in a school, for example, most schools, you'll have a debating club because we think it's valuable to teach students to learn how to debate. But you won't necessarily have an empathic discussion club or a club which teaches us the skills required to engage in an empathic dialogue, which is a different dynamic, isn't it? And it potentially has different results.
And you probably wouldn't have it in any other lesson.
Yeah.
So if we really believe it, that this is valuable, it needs to start filtering through the life. It needs to be the DNA of the school. Yeah. That a question could come up in maths. There's a maths expert over there. Would come up in maths, and does that teacher then allow a discussion, a challenging discussion about something to do with maths? Do they allow that uncertainty to present? Because if you don't allow for uncertainty, then we standardise, because the teacher knows, and then the students then wait to know what to know.
We've said about developing a bespoke, well, we're calling it chaplaincy for want of a better phrase, but a chaplaincy program that will run through our school for all years. Because what we're finding is that the pastoral care that a school typically offers is really targeted to, 5% of students who present with an issue. And that's where the pastoral systems kick in, and we do well in responding to that. But all of the other children who are not necessarily presenting with something, their level of pastoral support is not substantial enough, we feel. Yeah. And therefore trying to create, because like you said earlier, like the systems and the structures don't necessarily enable that without us really trying to create that. And that requires rewriting some of the rules. So we're on the process of redeveloping that across all of our schools, because one of the things that really struck me was we have residentials for all of our students to a place in Lincoln, and those residentials have all of the things that you would normally expect on a student residential, the activities and all the rest of it. But the one thing that they have, which we think is really unique to what Avanti offers, is that we started to have discussion groups with the students. And so these are groups where you've got something like eight students in a group, and they've got question prompts. And it's facilitated by an adult. And what we found really incredible was the response that they had to those conversations, and being able to learn how to engage in an empathic dialogue and to be able to listen and contribute was a real game changer. And many of them went back to their schools, and this was what actually triggered our redevelopment of the chaplaincy program. Many of them went back to school and asked their teachers, why can't we have the discussion groups that we had there, every week?
And it's completely consistent with the literature and Neil Mercer and Rupert Wegler, both professors at Cambridge, have researched oracy and dialogue in schools, and there's clear frameworks about how to engage in how to teach children to have these kind of conversations.
Yeah. And I think that's where those conversations, I feel, are also where that spiritual inquiry can take place.
Yeah.
Because it's from them, and it's going down the route that they want to go down. It's not something that we're pushing on them.
And it goes back to Tom and my story about Tom is that if I didn't listen to him, I wouldn't get the insights that I get from the children in the school. If it's on the adult agenda, nothing will ever change, because it'll be what the adults want or what the families want. If it's on children's agenda or young people's agenda, then something new could be, the what might be arises. It forces adults to think in a less standardized way, because you don't know what might come.
Yeah. And I think another piece of this is around discovering, and the student themselves discovering their unique contribution to the world. And I think so for us, that's our fourth definition around what do we mean by spiritual. It's about engaging with a purpose greater than yourself. And again, I'm giving away all of my interview questions now, but for anyone who's applying for Avanti. So one of the questions I ask is, to a candidate, is that, what is your unique contribution that comes naturally to you, that's your gift to the world? And most often, the response I get is, wow, what an amazing question. And I think, now, that's nice that they think is a nice question, but it's also interesting that to that profession who are essentially mandated to discover and to help children discover their unique contribution to the world, are not themselves thinking about the question themselves.
But it goes to the whole standardizing of teacher education.
Yeah.
Which in my school we're probably countercultural, because we want teachers to challenge and question and disagree with some of the things that I've suggested. If we go down a model where you just follow the lesson, or you follow what the structure is, and everyone across the country gets the same kind of teacher training, then you're unlikely to get teachers who are imaginative or hopeful, because it becomes or questioners or reflective.
We're going to start our own teacher training program, and one of the things that strikes me is that, to this point, I want to hear whether you think this is true or not. The emphasis on teachers in teacher training is about essentially what you know, and that's the process of teacher training, and that's natural in terms of that's what society does when we educate people in university. It is about what you know, and obviously from the perspective of how we're thinking about education, it's more than what you know. From our perspective, whether it's to do with character formation or spiritual insight, it's very much about who you are. And that's not a question. That's not a question that's raised, I believe, in teacher training sufficiently enough for individuals to really, to think about that. Because from the perspective of wanting to see spiritual insight flourish in our schools, a key question is, does the adult in the room care about spiritual insight? Are they on their own spiritual journey for them to be able to facilitate others, and as a person who they are in terms of their impact on students?
Yeah, I asked similar questions to a group of PGC students at Cambridge, and there was a kind of silence because they're there to learn to teach.
Yeah.
But there's no, I think that the best teachers I've ever worked with are the ones that are really reflective. Who, Eleanor, who's just left my school, she came to my office often and said that was the worst lesson ever. And we would sit for 10 minutes and talk about what went wrong in the lesson. So she's got a mindset that's very curious, wanting to grow as a human, contribute to the world, do something that is more than just a classroom. And if we're not trying to inculcate that in our teachers, and knowing that all the other stuff that we have in schools, all the other agendas, you know, the colour of walls, whether you have iPads or Chromebooks or whatever, all that other stuff. The thing that really pushes learning on is the quality of the teacher.
Yeah.
It's evidential around the world, and yet government, we get caught up in the trappings of that spectrum of the luxury side of what we're talking about, not the 270 million children who haven't got anything. So, you know, it's frustrating. You know, from my perspective, I had a really rich experience learning to be a teacher. The fact we use the word training is problematic. You train dogs how to jump through hoops. You know, we educate teachers to be educators. Even the language is problematic. So as we're trying to shift language to do with inclusion and children with special needs or disabilities, we should shift the language meaningfully, you know, purposefully, and be disruptive and say, actually, it was about teacher education.
Yeah.
Because I've never been trained to be a teacher.
Yeah.
I was inspired to think about how do you engage with a child who doesn't want to do what you want them to do.
Yeah.
That's exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, when you asked the question, right, like what do we want them to be like when they're 40? And the responses you get back are to do with their character. They're to do with their person, their being, their self. And yet what we focus on is not that. What we focus on is what are the technical things that they are memorizing, as opposed to who they are and what type of person they're. And I think that's, for me, I feel like a real shortcoming. I mean, you know, one of the points was made around we want them to be educated, and I think that's a valid. We want them to be educated. What do we mean by education? And I mean, the Upanishads say, what do we mean by somebody who's educated? Is somebody who's hungry to learn. So you know somebody's educated. How do you tell if somebody's educated? If they're hungry to learn, that's an educated person.
Yeah.
And that's a very different definition to, you know, this is what they memorize.
Knowing facts, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I'm, dead on time. Okay, so it's 7 o'clock. So what we're going to do is, because we've spoken for close to an hour now, is to open up to questions from the audience. We've got about half an hour, so if you have any questions, there's going to be a mic, so I'll just ask you to wait till the mic comes to you before you ask your question, and just direct it to whoever you wish to direct it to. From the back.
Thank you so much. It was really a good session, good talk. My question is, how can a meaningful spiritual experience be created during lunch hours at school, in our school?
Well,
You're going to have to think of a way around that one.
lunchtime at my school is just trying to get 630 children through without anyone complaining about they haven't got enough. That's unfortunately the reality in a big school. But what we've done is, you know, most of the children want to run around and play outside in a primary school. If you ask children why they go to school, they're never safe to learn. They go to be with their friends. So it's their time, and you know, the community making is really important as part of a spiritual development. If you have, you know, you go to church, you go to a temple, you create community. So I think that is a natural phenomena that happens in schools. But there are also a number of children who don't like doing that. So we have, you know, and we're not a faith school, so we don't have specific spiritual things going on. But for children who really struggle, we create different communities, really small communities, whether it's in the library with an adult that's talking with books about values. We have 5 values in our school, and we talk about those values, or they might play a values game, they might make games up. So I don't think we should impinge on children's free time. I go home, I don't want somebody to manage my time after work. it's their time.
I just had an anecdote to that. So I find that with primary school, they're super enthusiastic. So they have these, at least with our faith schools and with our community schools, they have a gratitude reflection. So a reflection before they eat about gratitude. And with the faith schools, there's a prayer that they all say in unison, and they love it and they engage with it, and it's really quite inspiring to see. By the time they get to secondary school, they have the same, not the same, but they have 3 prayers or points of reflection. But one thing we quickly learned, to your point, is that if you're the thing that's between them and lunch, then that's not a good place to be. And it's almost counterproductive to try and, as I think you're saying, is to try and like force it in there, and therefore to find other ways in which you can introduce that same level of reflection or gratitude, but in a way that's not impinging on their time.
Yeah. I mean, I think sometimes I went to my first 2 years at secondary school in a Catholic school, and there was a chapel, and anyone could go to the chapel at lunchtime. So I would often just walk down there and just sit there. It was about maybe 3 people there. So it wasn't a kind of amassed enthusiasm to go there, but it was a space to be. And so maybe creating spaces. This is a space. Is this space open at lunchtime so children can come and just sit here?
Yeah. Because
it's an individual relationship with the spirituality or the divine that can be developed in those quieter moments.
Thank you.
It's wonderful.
Thank you so much for your time for this. So my question is, I'm a long-time meditator, and meditation is about going inward. When I grew up, I'm sure everybody went to school 30 years ago, we learned all these subjects more from learning without the visuals and the television and the videos. Why so much of this introduction? Because that's very external in the sense, before they even understand, they're just watching and learning it. So it could be done, and all have done well.
Yeah, I agree with you in many ways. We have days when we have no computer days at all, or no screen days in the school. I think increasingly that what I'm noticing is a challenge to when children are so stimulated, and it is almost it's addictive, isn't it? The tablet or the if it's so stimulating that we need to compete as teachers, otherwise we become very boring. A piece of paper and a pen isn't as exciting as a short video that describes the same thing, and then you can talk about it. It's just we're competing against a bigger market.
And I think I'm finding it difficult because my daughter just started school the first time parent, but it's hard. I've not given her yet, but she's watching it. She's like, Mom, I don't get screen time or anything, so the questions have come. So I understand about catching up, but still, something could be reduced.
It doesn't stop parents from restricting or minimising the use. And I don't think in my school we don't overuse technology, but it is, if we don't do something, and also if we don't teach them how to manage the potential for being addictive to these things, then there's a disadvantage because their world is going to be very different. Most of the children born today will be joining our schools in 2027, will be retiring in the turn of the century. Considering how much technology has changed in 22 years, I found an orange Nokia phone that flashed recently. I thought that was only about 10 years ago. Just think what their future is going to be. So we do need to, I mean, I agree with you in some ways, but we also need to teach them how to manage the challenge of the technology, which has huge benefit as well as the dark side.
Absolutely. The second thing was I always felt, as a part of pastoral care, probably, you said like it's hard to give that experience at school, and I agree, having been to a few retreats and everything. But wherever we go, that experience is very internal. So just
I think there's in Avanti and in the school in Cambridge, there's a willingness to develop a sense of service, that we help one another out. For 4-year-olds, it's often let's help tidy up the classroom together, and then the older ones, it changes.
Yeah. I mean, we've seen, to give an example of the secondary school engagement, we've seen some incredible endeavours by secondary school students when there was lockdown, for example, and feeding the community, and they were cooking and serving and distributing when it was time to help in different. I mean, I could give a list of projects that they've kind of helped with and developed, and I think that contribution that they make to society, and it does two things. One is obviously it helps others, but it's so essential for their own growth in terms of their understanding of what they can do, what agency they have in having an impact on the world, which at the end of the day, when they leave our schools, is something we want them to carry with them, that ability to make the world a better place.
There's another child in my school, I'll call him Arnold. My school's glass mainly. So glass and children don't always go hand in hand together, especially when we've got rocks around. So we've got the third broken window of the century, I think, of the year, I mean. So Arnold went, a year ago, he planted tomatoes and fruit and things like that in his garden, and he sold it, and he bought me £13.64, I think it is, to help to pay for the window that was smashed. I said, I need 2,000. So he's got a way to grow more apples. But the point is, he didn't break the window, but he felt a moral responsibility to the collective to do something about it. That's powerful.
It's powerful.
And you tell that story to other children, and they think, oh, I want to be like, there's a kind of internal realization that's good to do that.
Yeah.
Especially in an individualized society where we're all meant to be competing with one another.
There's two questions there.
Hello, thank you for the session. What is the place for consequences in spirituality? And given you talked about the funding, restrictions of funding within the education, so how does the education evolve where that relationship policy can be implemented effectively with the personalized approach with each child, knowing very clearly that sometimes non-obedience, non-compliance needs to be not punished, I use that word carefully, but there is a consequence and there is internal hunger to correct that, like you gave an example of Arnold. How does education make that happen?
Yeah, so whilst I said this, we don't have a behaviour policy, we do have a behaviour policy, but the focus is on relationships. And we have consequences, but the consequences are meaningful and related to the crime, for another word, related to what went wrong. So, children need a very clear system. There's some very good evidence that parenting that is kind of laissez-faire, so parents say, just do what you like. We don't say no in this house. You do what you like. Everyone's free, everyone's equal. And then there's, I can't think of the word now, authoritative parenting. So like dictated parents. Dad's very cross all the time. Mum's got a spoon, like my grandmother. There's that kind of, those two have equally bad relationships between child and parent. So the laissez-faire, do what you like, and the you must do, you can't go out ever, have both developed poor relationships, and where the family is actually quite tense. The one in the middle, authoritative, where the parents say, we're the adults, this is how we're going to live our lives, these are the boundaries. Everyone's happier. Everyone knows how to engage with one another, how to be in that space. It's similar in the school. We're very clear what the boundaries are. And we hold those boundaries very tight. Children's job is to push the boundary. But our job is to kind of kindly help reframe it and say, this is what we do in our school. This is what we do in our family. And there are, in our school, there are kind of there are rewards. There's no sticker, there's no sweet, you just get talked to. So they come to my office when they're on gold, and we talk, and we celebrate. And I say, how does it feel that you've done that? And they talk about, so we're connecting, hopefully, on a deeper level, rather than sorry for this banging of the sticker. And then the consequences have to be meaningful, otherwise it's not fair. You know, if a child has done something wrong on the playground, they should lose some of their playtime. If they've been talking with their friends during lesson times and haven't done the learning, then they need to give some of their time back during their time to fix it. So there's a kind of reasonable consequence. Again, but it goes through this, you know, when I've spoken about this before, parents go, well, they don't do anything about behaviour in that school. It's all about relationships. It's not one or the other. It's both. It's the same side of different sides of the coin.
Hi there. Sorry, just one question. You touched on the idea of identity forming part of spirituality. How important is it for pupils to know about the British identity, in terms of, spirituality upbringing in that case?
Yeah.
I take it that in Avanti, most of the pupils are from the UK.
Yeah. So sure. I mean, I think that this is the thing about identity, that to get a wholesome sense of identity touches upon these different areas. I think the British sense of identity, which comes through, British values, etc., that schools do reinforce, and that they have a sense of that. I think those are much easier and routinely done. I don't think that there's a lacking in that regard. I think the lacking is the more subtle you get, the more difficult it is to address, and therefore the more likely it's not addressed at all. So therefore, the emphasis on that spectrum between the identities, which of course, are important in terms of the most kind of visible, tangible, obvious ones, all the way through to the less obvious ones, and for that child to be able to negotiate those different identities and how they see themselves in respect to each of those identities is a really important discovery for them. Because otherwise it can become, and that's where you get either fanaticism or extreme views or whatever you get, because there's a misbalance in that identity. There's a misbalance in the kind of way they see themselves in relation to others in the world.
And then, but building on that, also how they then connect with other people and become part of a community. So, I think it was insightful that part of your retreats in Lincoln, as well as climbing trees and all the other stuff that we all do, it's about creating a sense of we are here together. This is our community. So people feel belonging. So in terms of inclusion, do we ever ask children, do you feel that you belong? Do you feel included? Not have we created a system to include you? Because then, the alternative is the children are on the streets joining gangs that create gangs because it creates, they pick up on the sense of loss, lack of identity, lack of purpose, lack of community.
Thank you very much for your insight so far. You spoke a little bit earlier about the lessons that you've learned from the children. You both have your individual songs. I wanted to ask the question to both of you in terms of what's been the greatest lesson that you've ever learned from one of your students in your schools?
That's a tough one, because you learn lessons pretty much every day.
So somebody who really is my second year of teaching, and that's 23 years ago. I know what he looks like. I remember him very, very clearly. He shifted something in me about being a teacher. So his mum was dead. His father had killed the mother, and the father was in prison and had died, being attacked in prison, and he lived on the sofa with his uncle, who wasn't really his uncle, and uncle worked night shifts, and this child came to school via the sweet shop and had Coke and sweets for breakfast, and then came to school and was very angry. He started the day angry, and in football was the worst, because football never went well. In most schools in the country, football doesn't go well most of the time, but especially in primary school, but it didn't go very well for him. And he taught me, he taught me to change, to put my different lenses on. It wasn't about his behaviour, it was about the language we used to describe diversity and difference in the schools. So he would often come to my office and to my classroom and say, like in a huge rage, he would throw chairs, he would throw tables, and it was just very, very tricky for me to manage. And I would say, what's wrong? I would say that, and he would get worse and worse. I'd say, well, what's wrong? What's wrong? What he was hearing, and I realised later on, is that I was saying he is wrong, not what is wrong. There's something wrong with him, because he's brought up in a traumatic, his guy has trauma, the biological ingrained trauma. And I went on a course, a non-violent communication course, that many of you might know, and it shifted my thinking to connect with him as a human being. So he taught me, whilst I'm trying to educate him to learn English, reading, writing, maths, etc., what I was really trying to do is educate him about positive human relationships. So I shifted the language and said, I can see you're really angry. I'd love to help. And he would sit within a couple of seconds, a couple of minutes maybe, he would sit and he would tell me, they don't play football fairly, they change the rules, blah, blah, blah. So he really shifted my thinking. So it was kind of like taking James Biddulph, James, young teacher, off, and he matured me as an educator. He's now a very, very good kickboxer and helps young boys in East London not get into dark paths. That could be a spiritual moment, maybe, for him.
Yeah, I struggle with this one. I think there's, I'm trying to think of one single case, but I can give you an example of where, just picking up on James' theme in terms of where my thinking shifted on something. And that was a primary school student who who was responding to the behavior policy in a particular way. And the response to that behavior policy was shutting down his natural personality. And and my kind of response to that was to, maybe I'm not sure I should say this on record, but anyway, what I did was incentivize him to break the rules, because there was a sense of fear that had come into him. And when he did that, I saw the personality flourish again. And one thing that really taught me was that, there's a place for children learning to break rules and barriers and boundaries. And that's obviously that's a very, for anyone running a school, a message you have to frame properly. But I think a lot of good education systems do just that. They enable and empower and allow, and even to some extent teach children to be able to break rules, and obviously within normal, rational kind of boundaries. But I think it's such an important lesson. I think it's a powerful lesson. I think that's something that we want to try and incorporate within how we enable and develop something like a behavior policy. I'm bringing that up because we've spoken about it this evening. That there's a risk that in the striving towards a standardized system, that the way that you can easiest manage a standardized system is to have very rigid rules, but there are clear problems with that, and part of that is that you don't really get something extraordinary if you boundary everything in the ordinary. And therefore, I think the capacity for a child to be able to go out and do something completely revolutionary, completely, and feel the ability to do that, I think is that spirit. I think is something that we shouldn't lose in a system that has to be, because we need a system for education.
Thank you, gentlemen, both of you. My question is basically to Dr. James. So we touched upon homeschooling, right? So what's your thought? Like you said, it's growing or decreasing?
Growing.
Growing, right? So what do you think is the reason? Is it the reason because the society is becoming more heterogeneous, or what is that? The reason?
Well, the survey done by the government indicated that there were the top 3 reasons were real concerns about COVID, and that hasn't gone away, even though there's it's lessened. The second one was about just disagreeing with what governments want schools to be, ideological, complete difference. And the third was a real concern that schools can't help children's mental health. There were other reasons like we've got a stopgap, we're moving from one place to another, so we're going to homeschool for 6 months. There were more practical reasons, but the top 3 were kind of ideological and kind of mental concern, mental worry.
So keeping COVID aside, do you think that it's again in future the homeschooling is going to increase, or it's?
I don't know the answer to that. I hope it doesn't, because I'll be out of a job. But I think it's there's a perception that schools can't do enough, and we are struggling. Without a doubt, there's a huge kind of period of struggle, and I wouldn't. Yeah, I'm not sure. Do you know? I don't really know why whether it would expand further, grow. But I mean, essentially, you have to be wealthy enough to be able to do it, because somebody has to go to work. So it'll end up being an apartheid system, potentially. You've got kind of middle class, wealthy enough people to homeschool. Then you've got children, parents who don't mind the ideology, so they send them. And then you've got very poor children, or from poor families, who couldn't homeschool. It's a kind of moral, for me, a moral dilemma.
So in my opinion, I think homeschooling, as you say, practically might not be possible. So the alternative is to bring in spirituality in schools. I think that's one thing I think parents would look at school to provide or include in their curriculum, so that children can get the true essence, the family values which they see in the school they can provide. So that's the balance I think the parents would be looking for.
I think what makes Avanti and schools like mine quite different.
Just a question on in society we're facing a lot of things around mental health, especially at work. We're talking a lot about mental health and the way it's impacting everyone. How do you feel spirituality can have an effect, whether it's positive, negative, but what's your thoughts on spirituality and effect on mental health?
I think, I think this is a really interesting question. I think there is definitely, I'll say 2 things. There's definitely work to be done in terms of trying to understand that question and the answer to it. I don't think it's clear. I think it's not clear because what we mean by spirituality is also not clear. And therefore, when spirituality itself is kind of wishy-washy or airy-fairy, and then it's kind of like, well, what impact did it have? It's questionable, because it's like doing any kind of scientific experiment. You know, if the conditions aren't right, you're not going to get a result. So I think there's something about really trying to be specific, or precise rather, about what do we mean by spirituality, and being able to engage with that in a meaningful way. But I think the other side of this argument, I think, is that, look, you know, there is a mental health crisis going on around the world, and we know that a lot of that is in developed countries where there is access to all kinds of material benefits, and yet the mental crisis continues and increases. And therefore, the answer, to me, seems obvious, that the answer cannot lie in the thing that's causing the problem. In a society which is so materially advanced and opulent, if in those societies our benefit, you know, the response to mental health is not sufficient, if we're losing the battle in these societies, I can't see why we would keep trying to find the answer in the same space of materialism. That's the key thing. From my perspective, I feel that at least with within the context of spirituality, there is the hope for an answer. There is a hope for kind of a remedy. And I think spirituality is about hope. I think there's a lot to be, you know, that intrinsic kind of nature of spirituality within hope, because materialism, pure, unadulterated, deterministic materialism, is at its end, by definition, predetermined and nihilistic. And therefore, spirituality is an antidote to that. It's, from what I can see, it's the only antidote to that. And therefore, I think there are certain levels of mental health and well-being which require medical intervention, material solutions, etc., etc. Those are the obvious kind of responses, which, from a scientific perspective, we must pursue in terms of getting better at understanding what are the underpinning causes of this, how can we resolve. So those are the obvious things that everyone will focus on. Fine, obviously, carry on. But at the same time, there is something within us as humans, within our hearts and minds, where we need things that are not necessarily given to us through a material approach. And, you know, something like identity is a really good example of that, I feel. That, you know, if our identity is situated or is focused on something which is superficial, I cannot see how that will not cause issues with mental health, emotional health, general well-being. So yeah. I think it's incumbent upon us to look at something which can give us a more firm grounding in that regard. So, James.
Just to build on your point, the materialism, you could argue, is coming to the end of its time. The Industrial Revolution is coming to the end of its time. You know, our natural resources are finite, and the populations get bigger. So there's a battle for owning stuff, because there's not enough stuff to own. You know, Carl Jung talks about the spirit of the time and the spirit of the depth. So our spirit of the time is one of complex change. I think mental health problems have arisen because of this complete change in the world dynamic. Everything is much more insecure than it ever used to be. Well, not ever. That's incorrect. But in this, from my kind of experience and as a young person, but when the spirit of the times darkens, we can't look for answers outside, Jung says. When the spirit of the times darkens, you have to go depth. The soul is the response. That's where you will find the answers that we need. So in the education that we're trying to develop, and it'll never be perfect, because we're not only the ones educating children, it's the whole of society, the parents, the families, the grandparents, everything else is there as well. So it can't just be schools, but what schools can do in terms of mental health is like a kaleidoscope. We can give them different colour lenses, different experiences through which to look at the world slightly differently. If we put identity in there and raise questions of identity, we can help create more beautiful, hopeful patterns than the kind of grey, dark version that they've got at the moment, that we all have at the moment.
I'm just conscious of time. We have 2 more questions, last 2 I've agreed to. And then Nitesh and James will be around to, I know a lot of people have questions. So if we don't get around to your question, then I think we'll speak them up.
So you had touched on an important point earlier about if you want children to flourish and make a contribution to society, the education system in itself shackles them at the moment, kept that that freedom to truly kind of pursue their passion of what they're really interested in learning, not just academic, spiritual, holistically. So how would you kind of think the education system that you do to give them that freedom to really go out and pursue it? Because from my experience, I found that lockdown was a total blessing because it unshackled my children from the rigidity of the education system. It's like, okay, here it is, you have the freedom to set your timetable where, going holistically, not just academic, spiritually, to go out and discover yourself and really pursue your passions. At the end of it, they'll actually come out stronger and better and actually, more flourishing. Where it was, how do you plan to, put this kind of thing in place? Because that it's important for children to have that independence as well.
I think it's how you design the curriculum in a school, and how you create spaces for children to explore and discover. Because it is disingenuous also to say that children just off you go and explore the world, because they don't know what they don't know, and so it's our job as adults to put things in their way for them to disrupt what they know, to think, oh, I didn't think that. I thought this. I was discovering this. Letting children play in a sandpit, for example, gets them to one level. They play the same games, or they imagine new games. If an adult goes alongside them and plays alongside and asks different questions, their thinking and their learning and their discovery expands. So it goes back to this whole polarized issue of education. You do one thing or the other. It's not one or the other, it's everything, in my view. Children can be taught things, but they also need spaces to explore. So in my school, we call it playful inquiry.
But just to kind of expand on that, it's also to give them the confidence to think and ask questions.
Yeah.
Like my child came home the other day and said, well, it's nice doing Black History Month, but why don't we have a Brown History Month? It's more relevant to who I am and as a person to understand why I'm meant to grow spirituality as well.
Yeah.
But have the confidence to be able to ask those questions and pursue it.
I think it's about having a culture of openness. Let everyone, there's another child came to my office and we were just celebrated the late Queen's Jubilee, and at the same time I had remembered that I'd allowed an invitation for a delegate of ministers from a Middle East country to come to visit the school, and the child after school came to my office in tears saying, "Why did you invite them?" And he was saying, I said, well, because we would invite everyone, we'll welcome everyone. And he said, but they don't have the same values as us. They don't teach girls in the same way that we would. They don't let girls have freedom. So he was challenging different systems. But the fact that he could come and challenge the head teacher and raise that question is the kind of school that I want to run. And it's similar to Avanti, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
Hi, thank you for conducting such a useful discussion on this topic. So I just wanted to say thank you. But starting from the opening comment, what is the challenge challenge is also the topic was discussed in the very end, the material world. We are living in material world. One side, everything is material. The world is material. Everything we look for, like material thing. We've got social media, which is big setback and boundaries to progress further. We all have our own opinion. Like we do something else and expect something different from our kids. That is all the contradictory things we are living in. Social media, the world, our own problems. Our teachers, educators, they have their own problems. The government policy does not support all this spirituality and positive education. So the big challenge I see is how we can link all these negative factors or maybe the hindrance factors together and move forward. How we link them and move forward towards the positive and spiritual education.
Yeah.
I think we have to show it works, basically. If we can show our schools, and I'm a non-faith school, very different context of Avanti, but I think our responsibility is to show it works. You don't have one or the other. If we can do that, then other people will go, oh, I could do that. That's not too outside my zone of understanding. It is possible, but we have to make it work.
Yeah, I think the point around whether, how can we do that in government policy, etc. Personally, I don't think that government policy itself is an issue. I think I don't see anything in government policy which is really an issue in this regard. I think it's how much we want to place emphasis on ticking boxes and whatever else that might be in terms of external validation, whether it is by Ofsted or anybody else or rankings in a table. If that's what we care about, then obviously that will drive our education system in a certain direction. From my perspective, and for our schools in Avanti, that's not our focus. And I know it's not for, if you read the Ofsted report for James's school, it's one of the most glowing reports you'll ever read, but I know that that's not his emphasis. It's a consequence of doing what he feels that should be done. So I think that's an important aspect for us to kind of bear in mind. And I think just in terms of how do we kind of make it manifest, that's for us in terms of where we place the emphasis for whether as a school community, parents, staff, students, being on the same page in terms of this is what we want to do and this is where we want to place our emphasis. And I think that's for us, you'll see it in the Avanti way, we have this concept of parents as co-educators because we value it. It comes from a very profound place about the, in a Vedic context, the mother and father being the first gurus of the child. So that's there as a principle. But I think, at one point I just wanted to kind of respond to in terms of your, the kind of conflict that we see because of whether it's social media or other pressures or things that children are exposed to. I think a key role for us as educators and as parents is not necessarily, I don't think it's even possible to restrict them and their exposure. I think our challenge is how do we immunize them? Because if we can immunize them against that effect, then they can leave our supervision and still be safe. But if we just try and restrict, then as soon as they're outside of our supervision, they're not safe. And I think the challenge for us is to really understand what is it that can immunize us against materialism. And I think the answer is spirituality. Because spirituality is the antidote. It is the thing that can immunize us, not just children, us as well. Because it's not just the children who are suffering mental health crisis. the parents are too. And it's not just the children who are addicted to their cell phones. Their parents are. And it's not the children who just the children who are exposed to things like pornography. So, like, these are very pernicious kind of things which are invading our lives. And unfortunately, there's a lot of fear about talking about it. There's a lot of fear about going against the grain, that actually we don't want this for our children. Like, the world and materialism and the social structure around us may be pushing it upon us in every billboard that I see when I go to in the underground, or every advertisement that you see when you do a Google search. But that's not the way, and we may be limited in our own capacity to be able to restrict that exposure. But I think we can do some really important work in helping to immunize ourselves and our children and our communities and our families against that type of effect. So, I don't think it's straightforward, and I think, to James's point, absolutely, we have to show by practical example that that is possible. And I think that's the job of our schools. It's to show practical example that children can leave our schools and they can evidence that they can be immunized from these pressures, and they can behave and act in ways that they can be proud of. And I think that's a key thing for us.
Thank you very much.
Just want to say another massive thank you to Nitesh and James for joining us here today. And thank you to all of you as well. I know it's Saturday evening, could have been anywhere, but you've all chosen to be here. But I want to say, just pick up one thing. They spoke quite a lot about this idea of within schools the need to build communities. And picking up on Nitesh's last point about how we need to set the example. I really want to encourage you. We are going to end here. I really want to encourage each and every one of you. We're going to go next door and have a meal together, to sit with someone different, to try and connect with them on a deeper level, and to try and maybe discuss some of the key topics from today, because that will be showing by example that we're willing to go out of our way. We're going to try to come out of our comfort zone a little bit, speak to someone new, spend some time with them, get to know them, and connect with them like that. So our next event is the first Saturday of November. We've got another really special guest joining us, which we'll be sending out more information about very, very shortly. So please do join us there. If you haven't connected, we do have a WhatsApp group, which is admin only, so you don't have to worry about sending messages. And I know some of you may have received emails and whatnot. This WhatsApp group is a really easy way to stay connected. If you would like to join, you can come speak to myself after the session. Okay, so
That's it.
okay, so
Have a nice meal.